Coming on board with us now is Charles Prestrud. He is our Cole Center for Transportation Director, and we're going to be talking about the big transportation budget as promised last week. I said, Charles, that the transportation budget is an animal such that deserves its own time, and that's what we need. So, going into the legislative session, we heard DOT, Department of Transportation, needed an additional $1 billion a year. I think it was like 1.3, if I remember correctly, but who's counting such fractions these days? Just round to the nearest billion. Does the bill the legislature finally agreed to include the taxes and fees required to get to that $1 billion mark?
The short answer is no, it doesn't, but it does include a raft of new taxes and fees, including a 6-cent a gallon increase in the state gas tax, a similar increase in diesel fuel tax. Those, by the way, are indexed to kind of inflation. They're assuming 2% per year. And of course, this means that the legislature won't have to take those difficult votes to increase the tax in the future. It'll go up automatically.
I'm gonna scoot your chair just a little bit in here. There, it's this awkward, like in sports. Sports, you see them on TV and they look like they're far apart, but in real life, it's just this awkward, uncomfortable closeness that goes on. So go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
They have also increased the vehicle license fee, which will similarly be indexed to increase automatically each year. And they increased the weight fee, not just on trucks, but on cars as well. The tax increases don't end there. There is also now a luxury tax on automobiles, the sale of new automobiles with a price of over $100,000. That is not a problem for most of us. But for luxury automobile dealers and people who buy or used to buy those high-priced cars, they're going to get hit with an additional 8% tax on the amount over $100,000. So, and you may be aware there's already a $1 per tire disposal fee that the state charges whenever you're buying new tires for your car. They charge the fee on the new tire. Well, that's been bumped up to $5 per tire. Cheapskates like me will probably be driving on bald tires a little bit longer to put off paying the additional fee.
But you're not alone in that. I mean, that is
No.
one of those things where, $20 doesn't sound like much, but I don't know the last time that you bought tires, but for me, I was having sticker shock with just how much tires have increased in cost these days.
Yeah, they're not cheap. So motorists can look forward to a whole bunch of these new taxes and fees. Individually, they may not seem like very much. You add them up, it's going to be noticeable. The good news is that should provide the state with some additional revenue for transportation system improvements. But to answer your question, total looks like it's about $500 million per year in additional revenue. But that isn't enough to fill the $1 billion per year gap. And to complicate matters further and make things a little bit worse, most of that additional revenue isn't going to highway preservation and maintenance, which is where the biggest funding shortfall was. Mm-hmm. So they haven't solved that problem. They've kicked that can down the highway one more time.
Where's it going instead?
Well, that's a good question. And in the budget, 159 pages long, we can see that it gets spread around to all kinds of different projects. I have to give the legislature some credit because one of their top priorities was to direct funds to complete the projects that are already under construction. Because if you pause them and have to restart them later, it always ends up costing more. So they're dedicating some of that revenue to completing the I-405 Bellevue to Renton project, the 167 and 509 projects in South King County and Pierce County, the North Spokane Freeway project over in Spokane County that's been underway for years and years and years. So those things are all going to get completed, perhaps not on the original schedule, because as costs go up, they have to stretch them out a little. They have to stretch out the timeline for completion. But the budget also spends a lot on other things. For instance, bike and pedestrian projects, $200 million for transit projects, a lot for electrification projects. and about $1 billion for the culvert replacement work. As you recall from our previous discussions of this, the state lost a lawsuit in federal court some years ago. And so they are required now to replace all the culverts under state highways that are blocking the passage of fish. And this has turned out to be a much more complicated and expensive undertaking than they had originally thought. After they spent the first $4 billion, they discovered it was going to take another 4 or maybe 5 billion. And they're having a hard time getting all the work done. And it's hundreds and hundreds of these all over the state by the 2030 deadline. So they're having mediation with the tribes in hopes of coming up with a mutually agreeable path forward, but it isn't going to be cheap. And they're still going to need several billion more to comply with the court order.
One of the things that you pointed out in a previous show was that the planning of the state has been, either non-existent or has, they failed to come up with plans to guide the legislature, or planning has diverted from, from very specific metrics to kind of vague social value kind of approaches. Is there anything in the new budget that suggests a more targeted approach and a more careful approach to utilizing resources?
I wish I could say there was, but you will not find that in this budget. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the State Department of Transportation spends tens of millions of dollars a year on planning of all kinds. Some of it is project specific, like where they say, we want to widen the highway. Well, you have to figure out how much additional right of way you need and what was it do to drainage and bridges and pedestrian access and all those other things. That kind of project planning is necessary in order to minimize the impacts and to move projects forward to completion. The state also does a lot of kind of visionary long-range planning, but what they have not done is produce an updated state highway system plan that lists the projects that are needed to address the state's transportation problems with cost estimates and a timeline for their completion.
And a priority list of which ones would do the most needed. Yeah.
And that plan, which used to be the major planning responsibility of the State Department of Transportation, hasn't really been updated since 2009. And that plan was also the starting point for the legislature's discussions about how much revenue was needed and where it was going to be used. So in the absence of that kind of roadmap of transportation system improvements, the legislature's decisions just turn into political arm wrestling, and you end up with strange hodgepodge of projects, some of which probably don't make a lot of economic sense. And there isn't necessarily a lot of logic to the order in which they are built either. So this has been this has resulted in some, let's say, non-cost effective transportation budgets.
Judicially put. If the highway preservation and maintenance isn't fully funded, if that fund isn't fully funded, what does that mean regarding the condition of our highways and whether they'll continue their deterioration?
Well, the bad news is because there have been many years of neglect and underfunding of highway and bridge preservation and maintenance, there's a big backlog. And when you put these things off, they keep getting worse. And an example of that is just a week ago, the state had to close a bridge over the Carbon River. It was a 100-year-old bridge. They knew it had been deteriorating for years, and it finally got to the point where the bridge engineer says, structurally unsound, we can't have people driving over it or even walking over it. Well, the state has more than 3,000 bridges across the state, and many of them are 70, 80, even 100 years old. And too many of them have not received the necessary maintenance and preservation needed to keep them structurally sound. So my fear is that we'll see a lot more of this in the future, not just bridges, but anyone who's driven on I-5 in the last few years has noticed that, especially through Seattle, but in some other areas too, the pavement's starting to crumble. It's coming apart. And the state had planned on doing a major repaving job from downtown Seattle out to Northgate on I-5 this summer, but they didn't quite have enough money. So they postponed it for at least another year. And the pavement's going to continue to deteriorate in the meantime. And we can see that across large parts of the state highway system. So the sad news is that we can expect more road hazards, more failed expansion joints, a lot of potholes. And even though I have to give the State Department of Transportation maintenance guys a lot of credit because they are very good at their job and they care and they do good work, but they just haven't had the funding for more than a decade to really keep up with the need. And this budget that's just been adopted, it gives them a little bit more in the second half of the biennium, but not nearly enough to make up for the many years of neglect. As I mentioned before, former State Transportation Secretary Roger Millar described the system as being on a glide path to failure. Well, it's pretty bad when the Secretary of Transportation refers to his own system that he's been overseeing for 8 years as being on a glide path to failure. So the legislature kicked that can down the road too.
So I get so frustrated hearing about a couple $100 million for bike paths or something. I'm not saying bike paths don't have a place or a value ever, but I am saying when you are so far behind with the basic infrastructure of the state that's essential for the economy in every way, you're so far behind and it gets more expensive the longer you delay. You know, when it's a household budget and you must pay your mortgage, you do the mortgage first, you know. Here, we're taking money, diverting it to other things that might have a political popularity to it, but it's hurting us as a state and it's hurting the future and also increasing the price tag for children and grandchildren because that's who's going to end up paying the extra bill here. So it's, you know, there's a theft attitude toward the future generations in this approach to budgeting. So where does this new revenue for the transportation budget, you know, as it stands right now, go?
Well, it goes a lot of different places. As I mentioned, the culverts, you know, you're looking at $1 billion over the biennium or a little bit longer.
And they could have paid that out of the general fund because it was a court case. It's not, you know, we're not exactly driving through these culverts. It's a fish issue.
That's right. I mean, the state has quite a bit of flexibility on the transportation budget. Gas tax revenues are dedicated to highway purposes, but general fund revenues, for instance, from the sales tax and some license fees and things like that, can be used for all kinds of different things. In the past, the legislature has been very reluctant to transfer any funds from the general fund into the transportation budget. But the funding gap in transportation has gotten so large that this year they actually did agree to shift 0.1% of the state's share of the sales tax from the general fund to the transportation fund. And that does help fund highway project completion and things like that. But at the same time, the legislature takes a lot of money from the transportation budget and uses it for things that are only peripheral to highway purposes.
And the Climate Commitment Act tax, it ends up being a tax on gas, not a gas tax.
Yeah.
So that goes to the general fund. It's not going to help roads and bridges. So there's an opportunity cost there in terms of, you know, you make things X amount more expensive. It's harder to collect that revenue, you know, and apply it to transportation.
Yeah, and you make a good point. The Climate Commitment Act, which adds 40 or 45 cents per gallon to the price of gasoline and diesel fuel, is outside the transportation budget, though some of that revenue is used for transportation, but not for highway projects. The legislature was very specific that they didn't want to use Climate Commitment Act revenue for anything that made it easier for people to drive. So instead, hundreds of millions of dollars are going to things like electric school buses, a scooter lending library, all kinds of bike and pedestrian projects. I mean, the list just goes on, and it is a very large amount of money, but it isn't going to do anything to solve traffic congestion or improve the condition of our state highways and bridges.
Now, as of this morning, we were waiting for the governor to sign the transportation budget. Is there any possibility, or has there been any hints that he will veto some or all of it?
I've only heard rumors and they're entirely unsubstantiated. So
those are the best kind, most exciting kind.
My hunch, and this is pure speculation on my part, is that the governor is probably reluctant to sign off on so many unpopular tax and fee increases. But at the same time, if he vetoed any of them, then the budget wouldn't be balanced and they would need to cut some of the programs and projects that the legislature tried hard to keep funded, or in some cases to add to. So he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And we'll have to see where he lands on this. It's going to be, I think, difficult. And he's very likely having some conversations with legislative leaders about what would happen if he did veto any parts of the transportation budget.
Doesn't he have the option of not signing and it becoming a law without his signature too?
Yeah, and that's not exactly a profiles encouraged move, but I mean, if you're the governor, you should say thumbs up or thumbs down, not I'll let it slide. But that is a very real possibility, and that would allow one to kind of wash his hands of this a little bit and say, well, it was the legislature, it wasn't me.
Yeah.
But I'll say this does set up an interesting conversation in the 2026 legislative session, which is only, 9 months away that it starts, because this budget does not resolve some of the fundamental challenges and issues that the legislature faces regarding transportation. They didn't go away just because they added a bunch of tax increases. So those are going to come up again next year. And this year, Governor Ferguson had just been elected. So he came into it, fresh. He wasn't really in a position to suggest his own budget leading into the session. 2026 is going to be a different story. And I think he'll probably be much better prepared. What that means in terms of the substance of the budget he proposes next December remains to be seen.
Well, thank you, Charles. Appreciate your insights as always. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for another episode of Washington Policy on the Go. We will, of course, be with you next week. We're going to have a special kind of Spokane themed Washington Policy on the Go. We'll, of course, tackle issues affecting the whole state, but in Spokane as well. I also want to remind you, our Give Big campaign is going on now and tomorrow. Special matching donors. So if you give $2 toward Washington Policy Center's Young Professionals Program, there's an additional $1 added to that thanks to our match. So if you've ever considered, if you like the idea of supporting a future generation of leaders and getting them the tools they need to guide Washington state toward free markets, toward free market reform and greater accountability, I'd urge you to go to our homepage, WashingtonPolicy.org, look up at the top, and there's a link there to our Give Big campaign. So, and share that with your friends and neighbors and others who believe, as you do, that free markets provide better solutions for Washington, better prosperity, and better opportunity for all. And we appreciate you watching and sharing this video, and we'll see you next Tuesday for Washington Policy on the Go. Thank you.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.